my little mini review of The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. In fact, I loved it. Yeah, it was great. I think it was the first spin-off Jane Austen novel that I've read, and I think there's a danger maybe of writing in that genre, of it being too precious or trying to imitate the style too closely, which I don't think that's possible. This book, I felt like it really had its own universe while at the same time respected the Jane Austen universe and the universe of Pride and Prejudice. And I think it was a really good bridge, in fact, in terms of my own reading, but also in terms of sort of literary history, even though, of course, it's written now in the 21st century. It was a good bridge in terms of tonality between the later Victorian novels and some of those themes, and then the earlier, I guess, 18th century novels, like I talked about Cecilia, for example, which I went back and finished immediately after having finished The Other Bennet Sister. And I talked about, there was a scene, this is going to be a rambling review, like usual, anyhow. Not even a review, just thoughts on. So there was a scene in The Other Bennet Sister where they go to the Vauxhall Gardens for evening entertainment. And this was a typical thing to do for Londoners at the time. And it reminded me of another scene in Cecilia, for example, where the characters go. And it was a place where families would go, during the day or the early evening, from what I understand. But the later it got in the night, activities got a little more adult, shall we say, a little spicier, etc. And so in Cecilia, there's drunkenness and things like that. And in The Other Bennet Sister, their party walks past a group of working ladies. I don't remember how they called them in the novel, but basically sex workers, right? And the characters have a brief discussion of the fact that that's who the women are. I had technology problems right when I was talking about sex workers, of course. Anyhow, I think my point with that was just that sometimes the Jane Austen, not necessarily the novels themselves, but sort of the pop culture and all of the various riffs on her novels, I think sometimes it can get a bit saccharine and a bit precious. And it's true that the scandalous things that happen, for example, Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, they mainly happen off stage, so to speak. I mean, Lydia does run off with Wickham, and they aren't married and come back home, and she's not married, even though they have been living together. So, of course, the implication being sex outside of marriage. And they don't avoid that topic, but they don't really spell it out super clearly. either, I would say, you know. But obviously, sex and sexuality is a part of the Jane Austen universe. It was interesting in the Other Bennet Sister to work it in this way, with a brief mention of, oh yes, this is something that existed, and the characters potentially would have, you know, had situations where they might see courtesans or sex workers or whatever we want to call them. They knew that this existed. This was part of their reality, right? So it was a very small scene, but I feel like it was a significant scene to situate it more in the culture, and to situate it, like I said, as a bridge between these two other literary periods where they were more salacious things at the heart of the novels. Frances Burney, you know, more specifically talking about sex and the perils surrounding that, etc. And then, of course, the Victorians. This is a big topic. So, yeah, I appreciated that little nod, basically, is what I'm trying to say. And at the same time, I was sometimes worried that maybe the Other Bennet Sister was a little bit too modern in its tone, which is normal. It's written now, 21st century, so it's normal to use different language than Jane Austen was. And that, again, like I said earlier, I don't think it would be a good idea to really imitate 100% or try to 100% imitate Jane Austen's language. I don't see the point of that. And I think that the author did a really good job, basically, because even sometimes things that I thought of, oh, maybe that's a little bit too modern. I don't want to give any spoilers, but there was another scene with one of Mary's suitors that was also a little bit ole. Made one think of Byron, for example. And I was wondering if maybe that wasn't maybe a bit too modern. But then when I read back and read the Frances Burney novel, of course, written prior to Jane Austen, these things were talked about very openly. So I was like, oh, okay, all right, yeah, it's fine. In fact, it's not being too modern. Maybe Jane Austen herself in her novels was a little more circumspect, but I feel like the author here, Janice Hadlow, nonetheless respected the style and the universe and the characters and the reality of living in that time, is basically what I'm trying to say, without putting needless needless limitations on herself. I think she's broadened the scope a little bit and let new ideas breathe some life into the Jane Austen universe, while overall respecting the tone and the scope of Jane Austen's work, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So after my very long ramble here, I do recommend the book. Yeah, definitely.